Hey everybody, Kerry Waldy here in our local science classroom again, talking about the interplay between science and religion. Some say that they're in conflict, but yet there are others who say they just occupy different areas of knowledge. NOMA. The late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould coined the term NOMA, non-overlapping magisterium, where he says they really aren't in conflict, but they don't overlap. They answer different kinds of questions. Science has questions about the natural world, and religion has questions about God and about the ultimate meaning, and they don't really overlap. Well, is that true? You see, this can often be used to eliminate God out of the science classroom. And I want to look at areas where God can be a legitimate answer inside of the science classroom. There are areas where they don't overlap, but there are very important areas of our inquiry as humans where they do overlap, and there are some legitimate reasons to include a mind or a designer at the table of explanations. So let's dive right in. There's this whole area of origins that's an important aspect of scientific inquiry or just human inquiry, and God can be allowed at the table of explanations here. We can look at natural explanations or beyond that, a mind or a designer. For instance, the origin of the universe. Do we know of any natural processes that create everything out of nothing? No, we don't. All of time, space, and matter started at some finite point in history, and we know that because that's true, the beginner had to be outside of time, space, and matter and be very powerful. And so the effect is the universe. What's the best explanation for a cause? It has to be outside of itself. So God could at least be at the table of explanations here. What about the origin of the fine-tuning parameters? There are hundreds of finely tuned parameters that cause our world to be habitable. What's the best explanation for those? The strong and weak nuclear forces and the different kinds of matter and energy within the universe are all finely tuned. And if they were changed, life could not exist. What causes that? Do natural processes? Is it necessarily this way? The answer is no. So God could be at the seat of the table here of explanation. What about the origin of life? You see, I've read all these biology textbooks and they kind of intimate that life can form through natural processes. But as they study more and more about the 15 to 1900 minimal gene products that are needed in the simplest life, these proteins and these nucleotides, there's no known natural process that accounts for that. And so this is an area of overlap where a mind or a designer can be allowed at the seat, at the table of explanations. What about the origin of information? Life is full of information, and when we're walking along the beach and we see a heart that says, "I love Kim" in the sand, we don't think, wow, the wind and the waves did this. That's amazing. No, we know that only information comes from a mind. Listen, aren't you just using the old God of the gaps fallacy, you may be thinking? Where you're placing God in the gap of your knowledge here? Well, I think sometimes that has happened. I mean, my grandmother used to say that thunder is God bowling, and so she put God in the gap of the effect. What causes thunder? Well, God bowling. So that can be a legitimate use of the God of the gaps fallacy. However, in this case, it's not a God of the gaps fallacy because what we observe 100% of the time is that complex information only comes from a mind. There's no known natural process that brings information to bear in our world. So it's not putting God in the gap of our knowledge. It is on the basis of what we know and on the basis of what we observe that we say the best explanation is a designer or a mind. Speaking of minds, what about the origin of the mind and the will? If I take a materialistic view that says I can only allow natural explanations because all that exists in the world is just nature, it's just material, it's just the periodic table of elements, then what explains consciousness and the will? Because chemicals don't think and chemicals don't choose. God can be allowed at the seat of the table of explanations in these origins. Now, what about homology and dysteleology? These are arguments for the theory of evolution. Homology arguments talk about the similarities of structures that prove evolution. Well, smuggled in this argument is a theology that says a designer or God would not have done it this way. So this argument and this argument for evolution, both of these, smuggle theology in. It's not just a scientific argument, but there's a theological statement being made here that says God would not have created these similar structures for similar functions, and God would not have created nature to be as imperfect as it is. And then what about ethics? You see, we can do testing on animals, for instance, and scientifically it works. We learn things. But what about ethically? Should we test animals? That's a question that can allow God at the seat of the table when we're asking questions about should, not just could. In other words, can you get an ought we do this, or ought not we do that, just from testing something in a test tube? No, science, apart from a designer, cannot give us shoulds and oughts. But if you include a designer in the process, now we understand that there are certain purposes for things, and you can get oughts from what science tells us. Oh, and there's one more that I almost forgot, and that is history. Christianity specifically talks about a God who has acted in history, that Jesus lived and he died on the cross and he rose from the grave. And so when we're talking about questions of historical significance, this is an area of overlap as well. Are there archaeological evidences for Christianity? What about the manuscript evidence for the authenticity of the scriptures? What about the historical evidences for the resurrection of Christ? These are legitimate questions where we can look at it from a natural perspective, but also from a design perspective. And God can be at the seat of the table for these explanations, because Christianity says that God has intervened in history. What was he doing? He was looking for you. He was pursuing you in your heart, and he was making a way for our sins to be forgiven, and so that we can walk in right relationship with him. And so all of these areas are areas of overlap where God is searching for us, and he wants us to search for him. And so science and all these areas can overlap, and we as good scientists can see the image of the Creator in what he has created. All right, I'm Kerry Waldie, signing off from the Science Classroom. Godspeed.